It happened in the middle of dinner. The sound of my father's hand hitting the table cut through the clatter of forks and plates like a gunshot. For a second, everything froze. Even the steam rising from the food seemed to stop. He leaned forward, eyes sharp, and said the words that would change everything. "You're old enough to contribute. Pay up or leave this family." At first, I laughed. I thought it was one of his twisted jokes, the kind he used when he wanted to remind me who held the power in the room. But his face didn't move. My mother didn't look up either, just kept pushing food around her plate, pretending she didn't hear what he'd said. My brother Ryan sat across from me, chewing slowly with a smirk that told me he'd known this was coming. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I asked, still half hoping for some kind of punchline. But he didn't blink. "You live under this roof," he said. "You eat our food, use our water, our electricity. You make money now. It's time you start giving back." My mother finally spoke then, her voice low, flat. "It's only fair," she said. Fair. That word hit harder than his hand on the table. I looked at them both, searching for even a flicker of warmth, but there was nothing. Just calculation. Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching the scene like it was a movie. I wanted to ask why he didn't have to pay, but I already knew the answer. He was the golden son, the one who could break things, fail classes, crash cars, and still be forgiven before the dust settled. The rest of the meal dragged on in silence. Every bite tasted like metal. I tried to swallow my anger, to convince myself it was just about money. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was about control. Another way for them to remind me that everything I had, even love, came with a price. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words replaying in my head like an echo I couldn't escape. Pay up or leave. It wasn't just an ultimatum. It was a truth I'd ignored for too long. Love in this house was never given. It was loaned, with interest. And no matter how much I gave, I would always owe more. That night, something inside me shifted. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment I stopped trying to belong. Because if love could be charged, I was finally ready to stop paying. Affection was never free in my house. It was something you had to earn, like rent that came due every time you disappointed them. My brother Ryan figured out the system early. He played sports, brought home trophies, learned how to say the right things at the right time. Every win he scored bought him another month of their approval. When he turned 18, they handed him a car with a bow on it, the kind of gift that said, "You belong here." I didn't get bows or keys. I got warnings. Every time I brought home a drawing or a short story, my father would sigh and say, "That won't pay the bills." My mother would nod like she was mourning a loss she couldn't name. They called me a dreamer, but in their voices it wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis, something to be fixed before it embarrassed them. Even when I tried to please them, it wasn't enough. I worked part-time jobs, studied late, saved what I could, but my choices were never right. They wanted predictable, not passionate. Measurable success, not meaning. I learned that in our house, love was a reward for obedience, not existence. Looking back, I realized the ultimatum at dinner wasn't new. It was just the final invoice after a lifetime of small debts I never knew I was paying. Every eye roll, every cold silence, every reminder that Ryan was the responsible one had been part of the same transaction. They didn't want a contribution. They wanted control. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the words again and again. Pay up or leave. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I just left. The thought scared me, but it also felt like breathing after years underwater. Maybe I didn't need to keep earning love that was never really offered. Maybe freedom wasn't about breaking away. Maybe it was about refusing to keep paying for something I never bought. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done being the unpaid child in a family that only valued receipts. A week after that dinner, my father slid a folded paper across the table. I thought it was another bill or some chore list, but when I opened it, I saw numbers: rent, groceries, utilities, family contributions. My name was written neatly at the top, like I was a tenant in my own home. I stared at it for a long moment before I asked, "You're serious?" My mother didn't even look up from her tea. "We all have to do our part," she said. My father just added, "It's time you learned what real life costs." My paycheck from the small design job I had barely covered bus fare and lunches, but I paid anyway. I transferred the money every month, always on time, afraid of what would happen if I didn't. Each payment felt like I was buying permission to exist under their roof. They never said thank you, never even acknowledged it. It just became expected, another invisible duty I couldn't skip. Meanwhile, Ryan still lived rent-free, his car payments mysteriously disappearing, his mistakes forgiven before they even happened. When he lost his job for skipping shifts, they called it bad luck. When I was late once coming home from work, they called it irresponsible. I wanted to scream, to ask how they didn't hear themselves, but I didn't. I smiled, nodded, kept quiet. That's how survival worked in that house. But resentment doesn't die when you hide it. It grows in the corners, quietly feeding on every unfair word. I kept paying, kept pretending it was normal, until one night I overheard them talking. My mother's voice was light, proud. "Ryan's so responsible," she said. "He's the only one we can count on." My father agreed, calling him the real adult of the family. I froze in the hallway, listening. The same man who hadn't paid a cent in months was being praised for his discipline, while I was the one covering their bills. That was the moment I realized something cruel. They weren't teaching me independence. They were testing me. Testing how much humiliation I'd endure for their approval. How many times I'd pay the rent they called love. I went back to my room, shut the door, and stared at the transfer app still open on my phone. My reflection on the screen looked like a stranger, tired, small, and trapped. For the first time, I wondered how much more they'd take before I finally stopped giving. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day when my father liked to sit in his office pretending to manage family finances. He called me in to help print a few documents, something simple. I remember the smell of ink and old paper, the steady clicking of his calculator, the way sunlight hit the dust in the air. He stepped out to take a call, and that's when I noticed it. A folder on his desktop labeled Family Budget. I shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity isn't always a choice. Inside was a spreadsheet. Every column was perfectly aligned: bills, groceries, savings, expenses. At first, it looked harmless, organized, predictable, like everything else in his life. Then I saw my name. House income from daughter. It wasn't a note or a reminder. It was a recorded stream of money, listed month by month, with totals at the bottom. My stomach tightened as I scrolled. He had tracked every payment I'd made, every transfer I thought was helping. The total was higher than I'd ever imagined, higher than what he'd probably spent raising me. When he came back, I asked him about it. My voice was shaking, but I needed to hear his answer. "Why am I on there like I'm one of your clients?" He looked at me like I'd just asked the dumbest question in the world. "It's called responsibility training," he said flatly. "You should be thanking me." Most parents don't prepare their kids for the real world. My mother stood in the doorway behind him, hands clasped, her face pale. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were pleading, not for me, for peace. She didn't want me to argue. Something in me cracked then, but I swallowed the words building in my throat. I nodded and left the room quietly, pretending it didn't matter. But that night, I opened my own notebook and started writing. Not numbers, not payments. Moments. Every insult, every manipulation, every quiet cruelty they thought I'd forgotten. I called it my ledger, too. The difference was, mine wasn't about money. It was about truth. And I knew one day I'd balance it in full. The call came just after midnight. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, lighting up the dark room. It was my mother. Her voice was tight, trembling in that way she used when she wanted sympathy. "Your brother's had an accident," she said. For a moment, my heart stopped. "Is he okay?" I asked. There was a pause. Then she sighed. "He's fine, but the car isn't. The front's completely smashed. Insurance won't cover everything, and your father says you should help with the repairs." I waited, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Her tone turned sharp, matter of fact. "You have a steady job. We're all in this together." Those words, "we're all in this together," felt like acid. I wanted to scream. Ryan was the one who'd been drinking that night. He was the one who drove home like he owned the world. But somehow, I was the one who needed to pay. When I said no, she gasped like I'd cursed at her. My father grabbed the phone then, his voice booming through the line. "You're part of this family. You benefit from everything we've built, and when there's a problem, you pull your weight. That's how it works." I could hear Ryan in the background laughing, saying something about how I owed them anyway. That laugh snapped something in me. I told them I wasn't their bank. I wasn't their safety net, their backup plan, or their unpaid accountant. I said I'd rather sleep on the street than buy another ounce of their approval. My father's words turned to shouting, my mother started crying, and Ryan, perfect, protected Ryan, called me selfish. But for once, I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize. I stood there, holding the phone, calm in the middle of their chaos. When the line finally went dead, I sat down on the floor, shaking but strangely clear. The walls of my childhood bedroom felt smaller than ever, as if the air itself wanted me gone. I started packing. Clothes, a few sketchbooks, my laptop. I didn't have a plan, but I didn't need one. I just knew I couldn't stay. When I walked past my parents' door, my father's voice came through the dark. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back." I stopped for a second, hand on the doorknob. The weight of those words should have crushed me. Instead, it lifted something off my chest. I opened the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, but it felt clean, the kind of cold that wakes you up after years of sleep. I didn't know where I was going or how I'd survive. All I knew was that for the first time, every step away from that house felt like freedom. My first night alone was so quiet it scared me. No shouting through the walls, no footsteps pacing the hallway, no sound except the slow drip from a leaky faucet. The apartment was small, one room and a half-working stove, but it was mine. I sat on the edge of the mattress on the floor, surrounded by boxes that still smelled like cardboard, and tried to convince myself that I'd done the right thing. Freedom didn't feel warm. It felt empty, like silence after years of noise. I ate instant noodles straight from the pot because I didn't have plates yet. The window beside me rattled when the wind pushed against it, and for a moment, I wondered if this was what loneliness was supposed to feel like. But then I remembered the dinner table, my father's glare, my mother's silence, Ryan's smirk, and the emptiness suddenly didn't feel so bad. It was a quiet I could live with. The first few weeks were brutal. I worked double shifts at the design studio, took freelance jobs at night, barely slept. My body ached from exhaustion. My hands trembled from too much coffee and too little food. Some days I counted coins to make sure I could afford the next bus ride. But even through the fatigue, there was something electric under the struggle. A sense that every hardship was mine, not a punishment, not a test, just life. Every morning, before leaving for work, I'd look around the room, the peeling paint, the cracked tiles, the single flickering bulb, and whisper to myself, "You're not paying to belong anymore." It became a mantra. I wasn't buying approval or permission. I was earning something real, independence. Still, late at night, when the city went quiet and the radiator clicked like it was whispering to itself, I'd feel this strange tug in my chest, a mixture of guilt and fear. I'd left them, but part of me knew they wouldn't let me stay gone for long. My parents didn't believe in letting go. To them, control was love, and I'd broken that chain. What I didn't realize then was that some debts, in their eyes, weren't meant to be forgiven. They were meant to be collected. And soon, they'd come knocking. It started with a text message from a number I hadn't saved but could never forget. My father. The message was short, formal, almost polite. "Check your email. We need to settle something." My stomach sank before I even opened it. In my inbox sat a single attachment, a spreadsheet. The subject line read, "Family expenses out of respect." For a few seconds, I just stared at it, half convinced it was some cruel prank. But when I clicked it open, the air left my lungs. Every line was neatly itemized. School tuition, birthday parties, doctor visits, groceries, even the electricity bill from when I was 12. Next to each expense was a dollar amount, and at the bottom, a bold total, $48,000. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. They had turned my entire childhood into a debt statement, a bill for being their daughter. I laughed until the sound cracked into tears. Part of me wanted to call and demand if they were serious, but I already knew the answer. To them, everything was transactional. Love, loyalty, forgiveness, all negotiable. The next day, my phone rang again. My mother's name this time. Her voice was trembling, sugar-coated with guilt. "We just want to make things right," she said softly. "Your father feels hurt. Maybe if you paid something back, it would ease the tension." The way she said it, "paid something back," made my chest tighten. I hung up mid-sentence before I said something I couldn't take back. I told myself that would be the end of it, but a week later the whispers began. At work, a coworker mentioned she'd heard I'd cut off my parents. Another asked if it was true I refused to help them after everything they'd done for me. I didn't have to ask where it came from. My parents had always known how to play the victims, two loving people with an ungrateful daughter who walked away. I wanted to ignore it, to rise above, but the injustice burned through every quiet moment. They weren't satisfied taking my money. Now they wanted my name, my reputation, my peace. For years, I'd paid them to belong. Now they were charging me for the sin of leaving, and deep down, I knew this was no misunderstanding. It was war, and this time, I wasn't paying. If they wanted to make it public, then I would too. But this time, it would be the truth. I spent a weekend digging through old folders, screenshots, and bank statements. Every transfer I'd made to them, every message where they demanded money, every guilt-laced voice note where they called it family duty. I laid it all out across my desk like pieces of evidence at a crime scene. Years of silence, neatly documented in black and white. The more I gathered, the more surreal it felt, like I was building a case against people who were supposed to protect me. But that's what it was, really. A case. A lifetime of emotional theft disguised as love. I wrote my story slowly, late into the night, under a pseudonym. The title came to me without thinking. When Parents Demand Payment for Love. I didn't hold back. I wrote about the dinner where they gave me the ultimatum, about the spreadsheet labeling me as house income, about the $48,000 bill that tried to turn childhood into debt. I changed names, locations, details, but the truth was all there. When I hit publish, I expected nothing. Maybe a handful of readers, maybe silence. But within hours, the story caught fire. Shares turned into threads, comments flooded in, people argued, cried, confessed. Some didn't believe it could be real. Others said it was their life too. Different names, same wounds. Thousands of voices filled the space beneath my story, each one whispering the same thing. Me too. By the third day, local forums and even small news sites were talking about it. They called it a chilling account of parental manipulation. My stomach twisted as I read. It was strange. The world finally saw them for what they were, but all I felt was exhaustion. Then my phone rang, my father's number. His voice shook, but not from guilt, from fury. "You're ruining us," he said. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" I wanted to tell him that I hadn't ruined anything. I had just turned on the light. For once, people didn't see them as victims of an ungrateful child. They saw what I'd lived with all along. Two people who built their lives on control and called it love. And there was no going back. Emma reached out a few days after the post went viral. Her message was short, simple. "I read your story. I know what that feels like." I hadn't spoken to her in months. Not since I'd left the apartment we once shared, back when she couldn't understand why I was always so guarded. Now, reading her words, something inside me loosened. I called her immediately. When she picked up, her voice was trembling. She told me her parents had done the same thing, charged her rent at 17, threatened to kick her out when she couldn't pay. "They said it was to teach me responsibility," she whispered, but all it taught me was fear. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel crazy. I didn't feel alone. We started talking every night after that. Our conversations turned into an idea, a small online space where others could share their experiences. We called it the Unpaid Children. It started quietly, just a few posts and messages. But within weeks, it grew. People from around the world began writing to us. Stories of parents demanding rent from teenagers, of guilt used like a weapon, of love traded for obedience. Each message was another reflection of my own life, another reminder that what I'd lived through wasn't rare. It was hidden. Reading their stories broke me and healed me all at once. I realized my pain wasn't just mine anymore. It was part of something bigger, a pattern that needed to be seen. What began as revenge had become something else entirely, a reckoning. But healing has its own price. The more I listened, the more I thought about forgiveness, not for my parents, but for myself. For the years I spent believing I was the problem, for the nights I paid silence as rent for belonging. One evening, as Emma and I read through new submissions, she said, "You know, you didn't just tell your story. You started something." I wanted to believe her. Maybe she was right. But even then, part of me knew healing doesn't erase the past. It only teaches you how to stop carrying it like a debt, and I was still learning how to put it down. Months went by without a word from them. For a while, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they'd finally given up trying to pull me back into their orbit. Then one morning, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox. The return address wasn't theirs. It was from a law firm. Inside was a formal notice claiming I'd defamed my parents online. They were threatening to sue me. I remember laughing out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Fear had always been their favorite language. When guilt stopped working, they turned to threats. It was the only way they knew how to feel powerful. I sat on the couch, reading the letter over and over, waiting for the familiar rush of panic to hit. But it didn't. All I felt was clarity. The next day, I drafted a response. Calm, factual, impossible to twist. I attached every document, every bank record, every message where they'd demanded money or labeled it family duty. I sent it directly to their lawyer with a single line at the end. Truth is not defamation. A week passed, then another. No reply. When the lawyer finally did respond, it wasn't to threaten, it was to withdraw representation. They had backed off completely. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, watching the city lights blink through the cold air. For years, they had used fear to keep me small. But now, even their threats felt hollow. They couldn't take anything from me anymore. Not my peace, not my voice, not the truth. I didn't post about it, didn't tell anyone except Emma. There was no satisfaction in winning, only quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to prove anything. For so long, I thought revenge meant making them feel what I felt. But as I sat there, surrounded by silence they couldn't touch, I realized the truth. I didn't need them to suffer. I just needed them to stop existing in the space where my life began. The silence that followed wasn't revenge. It was peace, earned, not given. A year passed before I went back. I told myself it was just a visit, just curiosity, but part of me needed to see the place where everything had started and ended. The drive to my hometown felt strange, like rewinding a film I no longer belonged in. When I turned onto our old street, the house stood there exactly where I'd left it, but it looked smaller now, quieter, like it had aged without the lies that once held it up. The paint had faded. The garden was overgrown. Even the windows looked tired. I stood at the gate for a while, debating whether to turn back. Then the door opened. My mother appeared, her face pale, her eyes swollen as if she'd been crying long before I arrived. My father stood behind her, thinner, slower, his voice missing the command it once had. For the first time, they didn't look like people I feared, just people emptied out by their own choices. She said my name softly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. I stepped closer. For a second, none of us spoke. My father's hand rested on the doorknob, gripping it like a shield. My mother finally broke the silence. "We didn't think you'd ever come back." Her voice cracked halfway through. I shrugged lightly. I wasn't sure I would. They didn't yell, they didn't accuse. They just watched me, waiting for something. Forgiveness, maybe. But I didn't come for that. I came to close a door that had been left open too long. "I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly. "I just don't belong here." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. My mother started to cry then, the kind of tears that sounded like regret but came too late. "Families shouldn't break like this," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment, the woman who once counted my worth in payments. "Families shouldn't charge for love," I said. My words hung in the air between us, heavier than any shout could have been. I turned before they could reply. As I walked down the path, I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of everything we'd never fix. But this time, I didn't look back. The door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam. It sounded final. It sounded like peace. Years have passed since that night. The night I walked out with nothing but a bag and a promise to myself. Sometimes it feels like another lifetime, like the girl who stood on that porch no longer exists. In a way, she doesn't. I built a new life, one that doesn't come with invoices or guilt. I live in a small apartment with sunlight that spills across the floor every morning, and somehow, that light feels like proof that peace doesn't need permission to exist. These days, I run workshops on financial and emotional abuse, helping others rebuild what manipulation once stole from them. We meet in quiet rooms, share coffee and stories, and remind each other that survival isn't weakness, it's defiance. Most of the people who walk through my door arrive carrying the same invisible weight I once did: the belief that love must be paid for, earned through sacrifice, silence, or obedience. I recognize that look instantly. It's the same one I saw in my own reflection for years. When I tell my story now, I don't use names. I don't talk about revenge or expose what's already been buried. I talk about choice. The choice to stop feeding cruelty with compliance, to walk away even when every part of you is shaking. I tell them freedom doesn't always feel like victory at first. Sometimes it feels like standing in an empty room with nothing but your breath and the sound of your own heartbeat. But slowly, that space becomes something else. Room to rebuild, to breathe, to belong to yourself. People often ask how I finally did it, how I found the strength to leave after years of being told I owed everything to people who gave so little back. I always give the same answer, the one that still feels powerful every time it leaves my lips. They said, "Pay up or leave," and I chose myself. Those words have become more than a memory. They're a reminder that walking away wasn't loss, it was liberation. It was the moment I stopped being a product of someone else's guilt and became the author of my own peace. Sometimes, when I lock up after a workshop, I catch myself smiling at how simple life feels now. No transactions, no apologies, no permission needed to exist. The people I love today don't keep score. They don't measure worth by what I give. They simply meet me where I am. And in the quiet that follows, I understand something I wish I'd known all along. The truest kind of love isn't earned or bought or begged for. It's chosen, freely, bravely, and without price. When love becomes a transaction, walking away isn't rebellion, it's survival.